I think at this point we'll interrupt and start with statements by members, but the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation will have 16 and a half minutes remaining in his time when the House next gets back to debate on the question, and of course the usual 10 minutes for questions and comments. Déclaration de députés, statements by members.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, like the National Assembly, like the Quebec cultural sphere, and like our broadcasters, the European Commissioner for Economic Affairs feels that Netflix should be doing its fair share. He said, the status quo is unacceptable. Well, with this Minister of Finance working for High Finance, and with the Minister of Heritage working for Gangnam Style, we're stuck with the status quo. Quebec has chosen to impose provincial tax on Netflix subscriptions. That is fair and normal. But this government is stubbornly continuing to repeat the same silly things about new taxes that don't even exist. The least they could do is insist that Netflix pay tax like everyone. The status quo is unacceptable. We've been saying this for months. Europe has understood this. Now maybe it's time for Ottawa to understand. We need to get rid of this unfair and unjustifiable privilege.
Honourable Member for Sault Ste. Marie.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in the House today to pay tribute to a constituent and friend, Muriel Oliphant. Sadly, Muriel passed away suddenly on Saturday, April 7th. I'd like to offer my sincere condolences to the member of Don Valley West, who has lost his biggest supporter and his mother. Robert's eulogy of his mother, titled A Reflection of a Life Well Lived and Well Loved, was apropos. Muriel was proud of all her children, Leslie, Barbara, Mary, and Rob. Muriel was the very definition of a good neighbor. She worked countless volunteer hours for a variety of causes, such as the Canadian Cancer Society, Christmas Cheer, and the Central United Church. Muriel was also an incredible volunteer and supporter of the Liberal Party of Canada, and I assure you her legacy will long be remembered. Mr. Speaker, Sault Ste. Marie in Canada is a better place because of Muriel Oliphant. She now joins Len in heaven. This House knows how important our family is to all of us. Please join me in celebrating this remarkable woman. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Yellowhead.
Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about a very determined young lady from Edson, Alberta, Sarah Knight, a 24-year-old. On November 11, 2011, 2 weeks before she was to compete in the Taekwondo competition and hopefully a position on the Canada's Olympic team, tragedy struck. A car accident, a broken back, severe neck injuries. Sarah would never compete again, but determined, she rebuilt her strength, opened up her own Taekwondo training facility, and taught her skills to others. She became a personal fitness trainer, a role model in our community. In June of 2016, she did a preliminary climb to the base camp on Mount Everest. Today, she's back. She is at 16,108 feet above sea level. Sierra is determined to climb the highest mountain in the world. One more day to base camp, then more training, conditioning, and acclimatizing. Between May 20th and 26th, Sierra is determined to climb to the top of the world. From all of us here in Canada, go for it, young lady. You are what women's empowerment is all about.
The Honourable Member for Brampton South.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Mr. Speaker, Vaisakhi was celebrated on the Hill yesterday. On Vaisakhi, we celebrate the founding of the Khalsa by Guru Gobind Singh Ji. The Khalsa is symbolized by the Khanda, the symbol of the Sikh faith, and features two kirpans crossing one another, representing the concept of Miri and Piri. These concepts emphasize a Sikh commitment to both their spiritual life and political life, and an obligation to confident in justice and inequality. Sikh values of seva, equality, social justice, and making the world a better place are the embodiment of Canadian values as well, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of residents of Brampton South, I would like to wish everyone happy Vaisakhi.
L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Mr. Speaker, this is National Volunteer Week, and I want to take the time to thank the 30 million Canadians who generously donated their time to help their community. In Canada, volunteer work represents the equivalent of more than 1 million full-time jobs for a contribution valued at $56 billion or 2.6% of the GDP. But despite all the number, we strongly believe that volunteering brings a priceless value to our community.
In many rural communities in Canada, many essential services, from health to culture to education, depend on volunteer work. And we can't forget that without these volunteers, some villages would languish and disappear. But we also volunteer to come together and celebrate, like in my village of Dupuis in Abitibi West, which will celebrate its 100th anniversary this year, thanks to the hard work of many volunteers representing nearly all of our local citizens. I'd like to take this opportunity of National Volunteer Week to recognize and thank them in particular. You are fantastic.
The honourable member for Vancouver Quadra.
Speaker, I rise to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Triumph, Canada's Particle Accelerator Centre, a hub for discovery and innovation. Founded in 1968 as a regional tri-university Meson facility, Triumph is now a multidisciplinary nationwide partnership of 20 universities. Powered by top talent and advanced accelerator infrastructure, including the world's largest cyclotron and a new superconducting linear accelerator, Triumph is driving the leading edge in science, innovation, and technology. Mr. Speaker, as a perfect example of the value of the pure science that our government embraces, Triumph is enhancing the lives of Canadians as it continues to push the frontiers in research to advance science, medicine, and business. By asking the big questions about our universe and exploring the tiny particles, Triumph boosts the knowledge economy. By providing inspiration and training to the next generations of young scientists and innovators, Triumph ensures that Canada will continue to lead for the next 50 years.
The honourable member for Markham Unionville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. I rise today to express my best wishes to everyone in Canada and abroad celebrating Vaisakhi. Tomorrow, I am hosting a Vaisakhi celebration in Sir Johnny A. MacDonald Building at 5 p.m. I hope you can all join me. Sikhs and non-Sikhs alike will participate in vibrant parades and celebrations. I will be attending a Vaisakhi parade this weekend in Vancouver and a Khalsa Day parade in Toronto next weekend. I am grateful there will be so many people joining in on the celebration tomorrow evening. Mr. Speaker, this is also a perfect day to honor the significant contributions that Sikhs have made to our great country since Confederation. I wish everyone safe and joyful holiday. Happy Vaisakhi. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Whitby.
Mr. Speaker, I'd first like to offer condolences to the Whitby Fire Department as they lay to rest today Chief Fire Protection Officer Nick Webb, who died in the line of duty. As we celebrate National Volunteer Week, I want to highlight some awesome civic spirit and dedication in Whitby. In particular, Jason and Brenda Atkins of 360 Insights, who raised $46,000 for a STEM facility in Haiti. James Potvin, 9 years old, who rode his bike from Whitby to Ottawa last year and will ride to Coney Island this year to raise money for Grandview Children's Hospital. Isaac Wanzama of Geek Speak, who hosted a 36-hour hackathon to build an app to fight climate change. Wounded Warriors and their In This Together campaign to raise awareness for mental health for veterans and first responders. Whitby Fire and local businesses have raised money for children to get surgery. Neighbors gather for movies in the park to feed the needy in Durham. Mr. Speaker, I want to invite all my colleagues to join me in congratulating the people of Whitby for their incredible spirit of community and generosity. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, it's with great pleasure that I rise to pay tribute to Jean-Yves Feneuf and Mark Chaplin, who received the Governor General's Medal this morning for their exceptional contribution volunteering in my riding of Shefford. Mr. Phaneuf dedicated more than 40 years of his life to developing minor league soccer. He founded the Granby Cosmos Soccer Club and helped start Canada's largest soccer tournament. He was also inducted into Quebec's Soccer Hall of Fame. Mr. Chaplin, for his part, has volunteered for Canada's Naval League since 2009, where he oversees the well-being of the cadets of Valcourt. He's widely known for his great commitment to young people in our region. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Phaneuf and Mr. Chaplin, who are in Ottawa this afternoon, richly deserve these awards for their contribution to helping youth in our community. I'd like to congratulate them and thank them for their enormous generosity.
Honourable Member for Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, on April the 9th, Canadians marked the 101st anniversary of Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge Day marks one of the most important events in Canadian history. It commemorates the coming together of all four First World War Corps for the first time to accomplish what no other Allied army was able to do. The Germans had heavily fortified the 7-kilometre ridge. Canadian soldiers were posted along what was known as the crater line, only meters apart from the German positions and one of the most dangerous positions on the front. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of April 9th, 1917, the Canadians pressed forward. It cost 10,000 Canadian lives to take the ridge, another 11,000 wounded. For over a century and without pause, the men and women of our Canadian Armed Forces have not wavered in their resolve to defend our country, our values, and our way of life, lest we forget.
The Honourable Member for Bourassa.
Monsieur le Président, as a proud chartered professional accountant, I'm delighted to highlight an important milestone for Canada's accounting profession. Le 1er avril.
On April 1st, this profession celebrated its 5th anniversary.
Chartered Professional Accountant of Canada, CPA Canada, is one of the largest national accounting bodies in the world, with over 210,000 members at home and abroad.
CPA Canada's mission is to act in the public interest and to contribute to economic and social development.
Members of the CPA profession work with the government on vital issues such as tax policy, financial literacy, climate change, labor mobility, and international trade. J'invite tous les parlementaires.
I encourage all parliamentarians to join me in highlighting this work and wishing CPA Canada a happy anniversary.
Honourable Member for West Nova.
Mr. Speaker, 36 years ago today, Queen Elizabeth II signed into law the Constitution Act 1982, which contains the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter is a statement of Canada's principles, including fundamental freedoms, democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, equality rights, and language rights, and provides a framework to assert these cherished principles. The body of jurisprudence that has developed under the Charter has breathed life into the document. Nous sommes choyés de vivre.
We're fortunate to live in one of the best countries in the world, but we should never take this for granted. We must always continue to fight for freedom, justice, and equality for all our citizens.
I invite all of us here in Parliament, and indeed all Canadians, to reflect on the principles expressed 36 years ago in the Charter and the responsibility that we have to bequeath to the generations of Canadians to follow an even more free, fair, and democratic Canada.
Hear, hear.
Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, our nation grieves the tragic accident involving the Humboldt Broncos. While this is a national tragedy, it has hit particularly close to home for my community of St. Albert. 4 of the young men who lost their lives played for the St. Albert Raiders hockey team. Connor Lucan, Jackson Joseph, Logan Hunter, and Stephen Wack. Each of these young men touched the lives of so many people in our community. In the wake of this tragedy, the people of St. Albert have come together to show their love and support for all of those who have been impacted by this tragedy. Connor, Jackson, Logan, and Stephen, your positive contributions will always be remembered.
The Honourable Member for Laval-Les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, during a ceremony at Rideau Hall on January 29th, the Right Honourable Julie Payette, Governor-General of Canada, received the credentials from the Chef de Mission of Lebanon, His Excellency Fadi Ziadeh, Ambassador of the Lebanese Republic to Canada. On behalf of my colleagues in this House, I would like to wish Mr. Ziadeh every possible success during his term. He was Consul General for Lebanon in Montreal for the last 6 years, where he made his mark by modernizing Lebanese consular services for his fellow citizens. I hope that our new ambassador, that our relationship will continue to grow closer. Together, we are determined to develop our bilateral, economic, cultural, and political ties, and to work together in international organizations where we share common interests. Long live Canada and long live Lebanon. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, Canada has been lagging when it comes to meeting its goal of protecting our marine areas. The Liberal government committed to protecting at least 10% of marine areas by 2020, but unfortunately the government is cutting corners when it comes to creating these areas. Its marine refuges don't have any legal basis and are not respected internationally. That's why I tabled motion M169 to create a marine protected area in the St. Lawrence estuary. This motion builds on a different motion that I had tabled in 2014 to protect belugas and the fragile ecosystem of the St. Lawrence. This government needs to take action immediately and listen to citizens and organizations like the Society for Nature and Parks and the David Suzuki Foundation. So I invite all Canadians to call for the creation of marine protected areas to protect our biodiversity.
The Honourable Member for Carleton Trail Eagle Creek, which includes Humboldt, Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, Friday, April 6th, marked a very dark day for the community of Humboldt, the province of Saskatchewan, and all of Canada. And while there are no words to capture the devastation and heartbreak that too many families are experiencing right now, there is hope. A debt of gratitude is owed to our emergency medical services personnel, doctors, nurses, crisis workers, and chaplains who performed their duties with dedication and professionalism under the most difficult of circumstances. Saskatchewanians are strong and resilient, but this tragedy has reminded us that we need one another. At times like this, we draw on our loved ones, friends, and neighbors for strength. The outpouring of support from Canada and around the world and from members on both sides of this place also reminds us what is truly important in life: faith, love, family, and community. We love you, Humboldt. And our thoughts and prayers remain with you and all those touched by this tragedy.
The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, this week, Canada has had the privilege of welcoming young delegates from G7 member countries, from the European Union, from Charlevoix, which is the host of the G7 summit, and home to many Indigenous communities, here in Ottawa.
As they come together to find youth-led solutions to gender equality, the future of work in a changing economy, and climate change and the environment. Mr. Speaker, this gathering would not be possible without the work of the young diplomats of Canada, most notably the co-chairs Sabrina Grover and Max Sunik and the entire YDC team. As the first government to recognize the Y7 as a formal engagement group, setting a benchmark for the G7, we look forward to accepting the official communique of the Y7 this Wednesday, and I'm confident that the same can be said of the G7 leaders this coming June.
Mr. Speaker, as our Prime Minister has said, these young people are not only the leaders of tomorrow, they are leaders today. These young people are the proof of that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline was announced with the promise of a $7.4 billion investment in our economy and the creation of 37,000 Canadian jobs. And it was great news for an industry which was already suffering the loss of previously announced projects such as Energy East. Now, just months after this approval, we find ourselves in a crisis, and the future of this project is in serious danger. Was the Prime Minister really serious when he said he wanted to phase out the oil sands from the Canadian economy?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Speaker, the Government of Canada approved the pipeline because of the jobs that it will create, because of the better price we will get for our natural resources going to export markets, because of the importance that this will mean not only for Western Canadians but for the whole country, to learn that the future of the energy industry in Canada is vital to our economic growth. The Prime Minister has reiterated that objective as recently as 2 days ago.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, words without action are just simply words. And the reality is this government has a record of making great announcements, however, has an appalling record of actually implementing the things that are actually announcing. We have the third largest oil reserves in the world, and our economy depends upon the success of this industry. The uncertainty over Trans Mountain is costing us $40 million a day, and $1 billion more is fleeing our country. Why is the Prime Minister shortchanging Canadians through his failure to deliver?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we understand the uncertainty that has been surrounding the project, an uncertainty that is due in large part because of the actions and the threat of actions of the government of British Columbia, which is why the Prime Minister said very clearly to all Canadians on Sunday that he has asked the Minister of Finance to engage in financial discussions with Kinder Morgan and with others while the government looks at all legislative options.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister speaks of one province, but this isn't a crisis that's caused by one province or another. It's a crisis that is simply caused by the lack of leadership from this government and this inability of the government to actually get the job done. And we've seen this before, and so long as the government fails to step up, we're going to see it again. Mr. Speaker, $80 billion in investment has left the energy sector 100,000 well-paying Canadian jobs. And these results are simply unacceptable. When will the Prime Minister stop failing Canadian families who are actually relying on these projects?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, in 10 years of the Harper government, they fail. I know why they would be sensitive, because not 1 kilometer of pipeline was built so that we could access global markets. 99% of the exports of oil and gas go to one country, the United States. I think all members of the House would agree that that's not in Canada's interests. The Prime Minister couldn't be clearer. This project is good for Canada, and it will be built.
Honorable député.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, all Canadians in good faith want to see this project go ahead. It's a $7.5 billion project, and it will support over 40 Indigenous communities. They are directly concerned by this. They want it. Canadians want it to go ahead, but the Prime Minister himself does not believe in or like Canadian oil. He said it's time to phase out. He says we need to abolish Canadian oil. Why is this project not moving forward, the Honourable Minister? Mr. Speaker, we recognize the importance of this project. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline is in the national interest. That is why we support it. That is why it will be built. We believe in economic growth balanced with environmental responsibility. Alberta's natural resources are important to Canada, and BC has a role to play. BC has a responsibility, and we federally will ensure that this project is built. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the government believes in it so firmly that the Prime Minister said that we have to phase out Canadian oil. That's the Prime Minister of Canada himself who said that. That's what underlies this whole affair. And that's why we've seen in the past 10 months, the problems aren't just coming from BC, where there's the BC, the NDP and the Greens, but what is the Prime Minister doing to make sure today that this goes forward? The Honourable Minister. The Prime Minister and this government are taking the necessary steps to ensure that this project goes forward. We are taking responsibility. The Prime Minister has always said it was important to promote economic growth and address environmental concerns at the same time. That's what we're doing. Our Prime Minister has consulted with Indigenous peoples, which is something the Conservatives under Harper never did. We have come up with an environmental strategy, which is also something the Harper government never did. We are getting pipelines built, and that's something the Conservatives never did either. The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques. After a meeting on Sunday, the Prime Minister said he was determined to assert his will on Alberta and BC in this whole Trans Mountain file. But instead of calming concerns, the Prime Minister has made things worse. The Quebec Premier said that governments must cooperate on the assessment of projects involving multiple jurisdictions. It's one thing or the other. Either the federal government is cooperating with the provinces or the federal government is imposing its will on the provinces. Which is it going to be? The Honourable Transport Minister. Mr. Speaker, we in this government are taking our responsibilities seriously. We know that the decision on this pipeline, which crosses two provinces, comes under federal jurisdiction. That's something that the Supreme Court and the Constitution both recognize. So federal jurisdiction must be respected, and we are currently dialoguing with the two provinces involved. On Sunday, our Prime Minister held talks with the two premiers. We are looking for a solution. That's the constructive way of going about it. The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-les-Basques.
I have legitimate concerns about the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, and they recently elected a government that takes these concerns seriously. In fact, they gave their newly elected government a clear mandate on this issue. The BC government is just doing what it was elected to do. Standing up and following through an election promise is what governments are supposed to do. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, I think Liberals could stand to learn a lesson from this. How can this government continue to ignore both their own election promises and the real concerns of British Columbians?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier of Alberta was elected on a mandate to have the pipeline built. The Premier of British Columbia was elected on a mandate to use every toolkit to see that the project will not be built. The Government of Canada, the only government that speaks for all Canadians, will make sure that the project is built.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU.
This opposition to Kinder Morgan's pipeline expansion is strong, it is growing, and several First Nations have already taken the government to court for having violated their constitutional duty to consult. It is a sad day when, despite lofty rhetoric, the government also is ignoring its constitutional obligations. The government wants to talk about the rule of law. Well, how about respecting Section 35 of the Constitution? How about respecting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, free, prior, and informed consent? Whatever happened to that most important relationship with Indigenous peoples?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
The Federal Court of Appeal in the Northern Gateway case quashed the approval, not because Enbridge didn't consult sufficiently, not because the National Energy Board didn't consult sufficiently, but because the Harper government didn't. We were left with a decision whether or not to use the same process that had failed the court test. We decided that there had to be much greater consultation, and now we know that 43 Indigenous communities will benefit from this, 33 of them in British Columbia. We have co-developed with Indigenous communities. Monitoring this pipeline will include.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavik EU.
Well, Mr. Speaker, most of those so-called agreements are letters of understanding, MOUs. You can hardly call them agreements.
Mr. Speaker, there is no consent around this project. These decisions are being made at the expense of Indigenous communities, and officials representing Indigenous officials representing more than half of the Indigenous community are opposed to this project. When is this government going to take the so-called priority relationship with First Nations seriously?
Projects are divisive by their very nature. We know that provincial governments don't agree. We've seen all kinds of evidence of that. We know that even within the New Democratic Party, premiers don't agree. And we know that within Indigenous communities also, there are those who are on the side of developing the project and those who aren't. Ultimately, a decision has to be taken with respect to our constitutional obligations and mindful of Canada's interest.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has failed the energy sector, and it's not just Trans Mountain. The climate that he has created in Canada has become so toxic for investment that investment and jobs are leaving in droves. The energy sector is speaking with their wallets. In fact, we have not seen such a decline in energy investment in over 70 years. Here's my question for the Minister of Natural Resources. Does he even know how many billions of dollars have left this country over the last 2 years under his watch?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
That the people of Alberta have suffered as a result of the low commodity prices. We know that there were some 120,000 jobs lost, but thankfully, at least half of them have returned.
That's right.
We know that we have approved the Enbridge Line 3 replacement. We have approved the Trans Mountain expansion. We are in favor of the KXL pipeline. We have met with energy workers. We have met with CEOs of the energy industry. They realize that this government stands with energy workers.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader. Order.
No answer from the minister. Well, let me tell him. It's $80 billion that have left in the last 2 years under the failed policies of that minister and that prime minister. Those numbers do not lie, Mr. Speaker. Things like the carbon tax, extra red tape for investors, Mr. Speaker. Erroneous failed policies is why investors are saying they're leaving Canada. Mr. Speaker, how many more billions of dollars have to leave this country before these Liberals are going to reverse their terrible anti-energy policy?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
The natural resources sector is a very important part of the Canadian economy, and we're happy to report that the Canadian economy is doing very well. It's leading the G7.
That's right.
We have created more than 600,000 jobs with the help of Canadians, small business people, full-time jobs. We know that Alberta is leading the recovery of the nation. Why doesn't the opposition celebrate the accomplishment of Albertans?
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Speaker, the Prime Minister's failure to take leadership and the total abdication of his responsibility has shaken investor confidence in Canada. His failure puts at risk billions of dollars in investment and billions of dollars in future government revenue for important programs like healthcare. This crisis, Speaker, is about more than even the pipeline itself. It's about the confidence job-creating businesses have in Canada. Can the government tell this House how many jobs in this industry have been lost since 2015?
Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we're very pleased to report that jobs are being added to this industry in 2018. And as members opposite, I'm sure know, business confidence in Canada grew, was enhanced in 2017. There are many, many nations looking to Canada, looking at the recipe for economic growth and performance, understanding that in this country energy policy and economic policy go hand in hand, something that completely escaped the understanding of the Conservative government who came before.
The honourable member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Mr. Speaker, the shocking answer is 110,000 jobs.
Shame.
To make matters worse,
Shame.
the Prime Minister is imposing a carbon tax and new regulations that penalize Canadian oil exports. Industry associations, oil and gas companies, CEOs of major Canadian banks and investment management portfolios warn that we are in a serious crisis. When will this government finally listen to the experts, but more importantly, Canadian workers who are demanding the Prime Minister lay out a plan to ensure this pipeline gets built?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister did lay out a plan. It's too bad that the Leader of the Opposition didn't hang around long enough to hear it before he took to the airwaves, before the Premier of Alberta spoke, before the Prime Minister of Canada spoke. He didn't have to hear the Prime Minister's plan. Somehow he intuited what it might be. It might have been more respectful for the Leader of the Opposition to do a little bit of listening before he did a little bit of talking.
Check his water.
Order, order. The honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has said he wanted to phase out the oil sands. Well, Mr. Speaker, he's doing it. By introducing Bill C-69 and the carbon tax, this Prime Minister is driving investors out of the country. Petronas, Shell, ConocoPhillips have all left. Gateway and Energy East have been cancelled, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline is on life support. This government claims to make evidence-based decisions. Mr. Speaker, when will they accept the evidence that these resources approach is failing and reverse these job-killing policies?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we approved the TMX. We approved Enbridge Line 3. The government ruined the chances of Northern Gateway by insufficiently consulting with Indigenous peoples. Jobs were lost in the energy sector during their 10 failed years in government, and we actually have to thank them because we're learning from their mistakes.
The honourable member for Grand Prairie McKenzie.
While the mistakes continue, today, speaking in France, the Prime Minister reiterated his desire to see the Alberta energy sector done away with, phased out. Well, he's doing a very good job already. Under this Prime Minister, major projects that would see our oil and gas get to new world markets have been cancelled. Pacific Northwest, Gateway, and the Energy East pipelines have all died. Our fight to keep Trans Mountain alive is so essential because this Prime Minister has killed all of the other options. My question is to the Minister, does he support the Prime Minister's plan to phase out the Alberta oil and gas sector?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
I had the pleasure of visiting Fort McMurray with the Prime Minister. When we talked to energy workers, we talked about how much progress is being made, and it would be good for members of the opposition every once in a while to talk about the progress that's being made in Alberta on sustainably developing our resource, on GHG remission and reductions as a result of the innovation and the entrepreneurship. We on this side of the House place an awful lot of stock in the innovation and the entrepreneurship of business leadership in Alberta. We wish members opposite shared our optimism.
The honourable member for Laurier Ste. Marie. Mr. Speaker, in 2017, there was a crisis in Quebec and Manitoba with a huge influx of asylum seekers. And that was expected, and everybody has called on the federal government to have a plan. A year later, the same thing may well happen, and where's the plan? Nowhere to be seen, or very well hidden at the very least. A Twitter tweet said that action is needed. Nothing's being done. When is this government going to do its job and come up with a plan to address Quebec's concerns? Canada is an open and welcoming country for people in need of protection. However, our government is determined to ensure that everything is done through regular channels.
Also on irregular migration, as part of Budget 2018, we are investing $173 million for border security operations, as well as more investments for faster processing of refugee claims. We have fast-tracked work permits for asylum claimants so that they can put less pressure on provincial services. We will continue to do the good work that we do.
The honourable member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, the government of Quebec has put out a call for help. Since early in the year, the number of irregular arrivals has practically tripled. Quebec's accommodation and capacity in housing facilities is already at 71% full. Jurisdiction at the border is 100% federal, but Quebec pays the price for, among other things, the Safe Third Country Agreement with the U.S. Ottawa has to do its share. Processing times have to be brought down. Some files have been pending for 2 years when it's supposed to be 60 days. Will the Liberal government listen to Quebec's cry for help? The Honourable Minister.
Last summer, Quebec approached us through the irregular task force, intergovernmental task force on irregular migration, and they said that we should help them with faster processing of work permits for asylum seekers, and we've done that. We've slashed that timeline from 3 months to 3 weeks, and we've issued over 12,000 work permits for asylum seekers in Quebec. In addition to that, as part of Budget 2018, we're delivering an additional $112 million for more settlement and integration services for newcomers in Quebec. Thank you very much.
Honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, on February 22nd, the Foreign Minister apologized to her Indian counterpart for the honest mistake in Canada inviting Jaspal Atwal to the Prime Minister's events. Now Mr. Atwal says that the Liberal MP for Surrey Centre warned him that he would need security clearance before he could attend. So, Mr. Speaker, was the honest mistake the invitation itself or that minister's department failure to vet the invitation for security and protocol concerns?
The Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the National Security Advisor testified before the Public Safety Committee. I understand as of today, arrangements are now being made for a specific appointment for the Leader of the Opposition to be briefed and to receive the classified briefing that would be appropriate. It's taken over 3 weeks, but it's happening, Mr. Speaker, and it's a good thing.
Honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, the minister's right. The National Security Advisor did testify after 2 months of asking, after all-night votes in this chamber. The government was blocking that, only to have the National Security Advisor confirm that the suggestion by their government that there was an Indian conspiracy was not true, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the government refused to be transparent and release a full list of the Prime Minister's itinerary, events, and guests in India. Mr. Speaker, we know that one former convicted terrorist made his way onto that invitation list. Is the government's unwillingness to release the full list signs that are...
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, a headline last week rather well characterized the opposition's position in this matter. The headline said, and I quote, "Conservatives duped by a false story." In fact, Mr. Speaker, they need to have the classified briefing to fully understand the facts and the context. That briefing was offered 3 weeks ago. The opposition has now accepted the briefing. It's being scheduled in the next short while, and that's a good thing to make sure that they don't be duped anymore.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, we have to wonder who's duping who, because yesterday we heard evidence from National Security Advisor Daniel Jean, and the Prime Minister is complicating a serious situation by refusing to answer questions. We were hoping the Daniel Jean's testimony would shed light on the Atwell affair, but it didn't. So I'll maybe have more success today if I ask a very simple question. Who in the PMO signed off on Daniel Jean's media briefing? The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, the Prime Minister and Mr. Jean have been completely in sync with each other in what they have said publicly about this matter. The only contradiction, if you check the record in the House and outside the House, the only contradiction is in fact coming from the opposition. The solution for that is the classified briefing that was offered 3 weeks ago to the Leader of the Opposition. That offer has now been accepted and the briefing is being scheduled, and that's a good thing.
Honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. What's clear, Mr. Speaker, is that the National Security Advisor confirmed yesterday that India wasn't part of a conspiracy to embarrass Canada, but the Prime Minister said the opposite loudly and clearly. Since Daniel Jean is contradicting the Prime Minister, and since it's very clear the Prime Minister was wrong to make those accusations, will the Prime Minister finally apologize to the Indian government for hatching this conspiracy theory?
For Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed the opposition that made that accusation in the House of Commons time and time and time again, and they were wrong.
Honourable member for Victoria.
Due to lack of funding, the Victoria Sexual Assault Centre has had to discontinue its hotline after decades of service. Year in, year out, the hotline has helped hundreds of women in Victoria. Across the country, rape crisis centres face the same urgent problem, and with the surge of victims coming forward after the Me Too movement, the situation just gets worse. Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister is truly concerned with the well-being of women and sexual assault victims, why doesn't he provide in the budget stable, predictable operating funding to rape crisis centres?
Minister for the Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for his commitment to gender equality and point out that Budget 2018 built on our investments to advance gender equality in Canada. Funding for women's organizations doubled, Mr. Speaker. Funding for rape crisis centres doubled, Mr. Speaker. That does not include the addition that we have the first gender-based violence strategy for prevention in the history of this country, and I would add that the member from the opposite party please add that to the report card, which has so unkindly missed this important investment in Canadian women.
Member for Churchill-Kiwatanuk-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister brags about his feminist budget, but it still leaves many women behind. It does nothing to address the specific challenges faced by Indigenous and racialized women, who we know face higher rates of violence, poverty, housing insecurity, and the list goes on. And while this government claims to care about them, there's no action to prove it. So when will the Prime Minister stop spinning us and the world on his faux feminism and actually invest into improving women's lives?
Mr. Speaker, Budget 2018 was the first federal budget in the history of Confederation to have an intersectional gendered lens applied to all new spendings. because we believe that when we invest in women, we improve the economy for the middle class and those working hard to join it. We've invested in women's organizations. We've invested in Indigenous communities in historic ways with more work remaining. We're listening to women's leaders across the country who are applauding our efforts for advancing gender equality, and we're also leading the G7 in our work through our presidency this year.
Number 4, Cloverdale, Langley City.
Mr. Speaker, no relationship is more important to this government than its relationship with Indigenous peoples. Far beyond my province of British Columbia, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project stands to create jobs, grow Canada's economy, and respect environmental commitments. Benefits include over $300 million in mutual benefit agreements signed with 43 First Nations. Many First Nations recognize this project as a source of prosperity and opportunity. Can the minister responsible inform this House of our approach to engage meaningful with Indigenous peoples on this crucial resource development project?
Minister of Natural Resources.
For the question and for his support of this important project. The review of the TMX project was the most exhaustive in the history of pipelines in Canada. 118 Indigenous groups had their voices heard, and we co-developed with First Nations an historic Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee to ensure the project moves forward in the safest and most sustainable way possible. Environmental protection, economic growth, and a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples. Those are the pillars of this government's approach to resource development.
Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
The Prime Minister recently sent the Liberal MP for Mississauga, Aaron Mills, to bring greetings on his behalf at an event organized by the Anti-Israel Palestine House. This event starred a Palestinian activist who supports suicide bombings and who met with President Assad of Assyria in 2017. The activist said, and I will quote, "I am proud of my meeting with President Assad. President Assad is not a murderer or a butcher." This after Assad used illegal chemical weapons against innocent civilians. Now, why would the Prime Minister send greetings to an event starring a friend of Assad?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, our government has been clear in its position of condemnation against the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons and its indiscriminate violence against its own citizens. We've been clear that that must end and that they must engage in meaningful negotiation. We have been equally clear on our position that Canada is a steadfast ally and friend of Israel and friend of the Palestinian people, and we are committed to a just and lasting and durable peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israel.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, the ethical lapses and inconsistencies of this Prime Minister has already been too costly, but there's even worse, and this is the last straw. Now, the Prime Minister and his team are being complacent about friends of Assad's Syrian regime. Mr. Speaker, Canadians need to know how this latest blunder could have happened. Will the Prime Minister tell us why greetings were sent to an event where the guest of honour was an Assad ally? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, once again, we have been very clear in our condemnation of the use of chemical weapons in Ghouta, and we supported the decision of the United States and France and the UK to weaken the ability of Assad's regime to attack its own civilians with chemical weapons. We condemn Assad's regime and its supporters, Russia and Iran, for these violations of human rights.
Member for Thornhill.
What we have here, Mr. Speaker, is a blatant, inexcusable endorsement of a notorious apologist for the brutal, terror-sponsoring, human rights-abusing president of Syria. Words of praise not offered by a merely misguided member of Parliament, pandering for votes with an organization with a history of support for extremism and terror, but on behalf of the Prime Minister of Canada. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister distance himself with this outrageous tribute in his name?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I've had the chance to stand twice now, and I will do it a third time to reiterate this government's clear position of condemnation against the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. We have been clear that the Assad regime must end its indiscriminate killing of its own citizens and engage in meaningful negotiation to achieve a just and lasting peace in Syria. We've been clear from the very beginning, and we will continue to condemn the use of chemical weapons and that indiscriminate killing of citizens done by the Assad regime.
Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Mississauga, Erin Mills, may be willing to stand with an extremist supporter she addresses as Brother Amin. She may be willing to praise a man who denies President Assad is a murderer and a butcher in return, Mr. Speaker, for support in the next federal election. But, Mr. Speaker, the question for the Prime Minister, will he disassociate himself from this misguided tribute to extremism made by the member in the Prime Minister's name?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, one final time. Canada's position is strong and clear. We condemn the use of chemical weapons by the murderous Assad regime. The Assad regime must end its indiscriminate violence against its own people, and it must engage in meaningful negotiations.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, the NDP published its gender report card on women's equality for Budget 2018, and with respect to the most important issues for women, the government gets a fail. Nothing was done to improve women's access to public transit that they use more than men do, and that is lacking in rural areas. Nothing was done to support pay equity, and nothing was done to support a universal affordable daycare program. Will the government commit to invest now the necessary funds to ensure equality for women?
The Minister for the Status of Women.
Quand nous investissons dans
Mr. Speaker, when we invest in women, we improve the economy for everyone.
We grow the economy for everyone. This philosophy is at the heart of our investments in communities across the country. I have to add, Mr. Speaker, that my honourable colleague is wrong. We are investing in lifting hundreds of thousands of Canadian kids out of poverty. We are investing historic amounts in infrastructure, including public transit. We have committed to introducing pay equity legislation this fall with additional funds focused on pay transparency. We also have invested in a historic strategy to advance and prevent gender-based violence while doubling funding for women's organizations, because when we invest in women, Mr. Speaker, we grow the economy for everyone.
Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Today, on Equality Day, I gave Liberals a failing grade in our NDP report card on women's equality in Budget 2018. While the Prime Minister claims he's a feminist, he's failed to act on the most pressing challenges facing women in Canada. This budget provides $0 for pay equity, no money for universal affordable childcare, and doesn't reform EI requirements that discriminate against women. When will the Prime Minister put his money where his mouth is and stop making women wait?
Minister for the Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate my honourable colleague's commitment to gender equality, but I have to point out the inaccuracies and the omissions in the NDP report card. The women's groups across the country and indeed around the world are applauding our Prime Minister and our government's efforts to advance gender equality. The first budget to have an intersectional gendered lens applied to it was Budget 2018, but it will not be the last, Mr. Speaker. We will be legislating this process so that future governments continue this work. Pay equity is going to be introduced in this House in the fall, and I'm sure it will have her support.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, we have liberal complacency at the borders, and it means that Quebec is suffering, and there will be increased numbers of illegal migrants. Are they going to have to open up the Olympic Stadium? The Liberal government is taking this lightly. The PM thinks he can solve it with just lovely words. When will the Prime Minister and the Liberals take responsibility and deal with the problem they tackled themselves and support the Quebec government?
Pays ouvert, accueillant.
Mr. Speaker, there are people who need protection. Our government is determined to ensure that this is done.
On issues affecting Quebec and other provinces through the Intergovernmental Task Force on Irregular Migration, we've listened carefully to concerns raised by Quebec. Part of Budget 2018 contained a $173 million investment in faster processing of asylum claims as well as border security operations. We will continue to work closely with Quebec to address any.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse-les-Etchemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and these Liberals are asleep at the switch. We're talking about 300 to 400 daily illegal entries. It's going to be chaos, Mr. Speaker. And what are they doing? They're just closing the door on Quebec. We have 4 exasperated ministers in Quebec who are asking for Canada to act. I'd just like to remind the member for Les Etchemins-Lévis that comments have to be made through the Speaker. The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Reducing processing times for work permits from 3 months to 3 weeks is not doing nothing. It's doing something. Issuing 12,000 work permits for asylum seekers so that we minimize pressure on Quebec social services is doing something. Increasing settlement and integration services money by $112 million is doing something. Increasing the Canada social transfer envelope by almost $80 million is doing something. We are here taking action, working with Quebec, collaborating closely. They're the party that left us with a broken immigration system.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, middle-class Canadians are paying more under these Liberals. One woman told me she lost her home because of this government. And what about diabetics who are unreasonably denied the disability tax credit? Instead of actually helping Canadians, we see the Minister of Natural Resources buying 3,600 Facebook likes for $5,000. Does the Minister of Natural Resources believe that $5,000 is better spent purchasing Facebook likes than on helping vulnerable Canadians, Mr. Speaker?
Wow. The Minister for Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what we've been focused on. We've been focused on the economy. In this last budget, we increased funding for regional development agencies to particularly help those rural and remote communities. And you know what the members opposite did? They opposed that time and time again. For 21 hours, they opposed our budget measures to help Canadians. And I can tell you right now, Mr. Speaker, our plan is working. It has helped create 600,000 jobs. We have a low historic unemployment rate, and we'll continue to focus on the economy and continue to focus on Canadians.
Honourable Member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle. Mr. Speaker, the government recently launched its housing initiative in federal communities, which will ensure affordability and stability for residents of more than 50,000 community housing complexes that are administered by the federal government throughout the country. Can the Minister responsible for housing tell this House how this new initiative ties in with the broader goals of the very first national housing strategy in Canada? Thank you. The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to begin by thanking and congratulating the member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle for her important work on community housing. On the 22nd of November last, we announced and launched the very first national housing strategy in the history of Canada. $40 billion invested over 10 years to lift hundreds of Canadian families out of unaffordable housing. And last February, we launched the community housing project that will protect 55,000 at-risk Canadian families. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work in order to ensure
Eagle Creek.
Farmers and manufacturers employ millions of Canadians and contribute billions of dollars to our economy. Due to this Liberal government's weak response to the current rail transportation crisis and the many flaws in C-49, our farmers and shippers will continue to suffer. This morning I met with a manufacturer who has already lost $40 million this year due to shipping issues. When will the Minister of Transport stop ignoring the plight of our farmers, shippers, and manufacturers and do his job?
Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, our government presented last fall a very balanced bill to address the issue of the transportation of grain, which is so important to our farmers, and of other commodities. And I can't believe still today that the Harper Conservatives voted against that bill. And they say they are the friends of the farmers, but they voted against that bill. Mr. Speaker, I will take no lessons from a government that doesn't even support our farmers.
The honourable member for order. The honourable. Order. Shh. The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard nothing since the final report by Bob Rae, Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar. He argued that Canada should take a leadership role in responding to the Rohingya crisis by leading an international effort to investigate and collect evidence of crimes against humanity, ramping up humanitarian aid and welcoming more Rohingya refugees. We've heard nothing. Will the government respond to these calls to action, and will there be more targeted sanctions?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we welcome the release of Mr. Rae's report and the recommendations contained there within. We have certainly remained seized by the unacceptable persecution of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people. These are clear crimes against humanity, which is why we have sanctioned a key military leader responsible for these crimes. In addition, Canada has been one of the top donors to this crisis. Since the beginning of 2017, we've allocated nearly $46 million of humanitarian aid, and we will be assessing the recommendations in this report, and we'll have a reply in the coming weeks with further measures that Canada will take.
The member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, problem solving and technical knowledge are essential if we want to develop the defense industry and counter emerging threats. With innovation, we can develop the necessary capacity to face modern security threats.
New defense policy, strong, secure, engage, our government announced that it would invest $1.6 billion into Canada's innovation community over the next 20 years. Can the minister inform this House on how our government is fulfilling its commitments to reach out to Canada's most innovative and creative minds?
Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, for his question and the important work that he does for his constituents. Last week, I was proud to announce a $313 million investment in the new Innovation for Defense Excellence and Security Program, IDEAS for short. Our government believes that investing in science and innovation will help the Canadian Armed Forces remain at the cutting edge of technology. Through IDEAS, we are calling on Canada's most creative and innovative minds to help develop solutions to today's and tomorrow's defense challenges. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Today in Calgary, first-degree murder charges involving notorious gang leader Nick Chan were thrown out of court due to delay. A year and a half ago, 10 new judicial spots were established to deal with the backlog in Alberta's courts. A year and a half later, the Minister of Justice has managed to fill just one of these vacancies. Clearly, the Minister is not doing her job. Will she take responsibility for the release of this dangerous criminal?
Minister of Justice.
I take full responsibility for continuing to appoint the most meritorious candidates to the Superior Court benches across this country. To date, I have appointed 167 candidates to judges to the benches, and we will continue to follow a thorough review process going through the independent judicial advisory boards to continue to apply and appoint judges in all provinces, including in the province of Alberta.
Order.
The Honourable Member for La Pointe de l'Île. Mr. Speaker, For 6 years now, Raif Badawi has been in prison. His spouse, Ensaf Haidar, came to Ottawa to ensure that Canada does all it can to make sure that he is released. Quebec brought forward a unanimous motion last week. And to protect her husband, Ms. Haidar is calling on Canada to grant him honorary citizenship. Will the Minister of International Relations and the Minister of Immigration act to help with this humanitarian case and meet with Ms. Haidar? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The honourable member for his question, and I want to reiterate our commitment to continuing to raise the case of Mr. Badawi at the highest level. We have done that in the past. We will continue to do so. I, myself, and the Minister have been in touch with the wife of Mr. Badawi, her courageous work. We support her in her endeavour, and we will not stop until this family is reunited.
The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes, Verchères. Well, are you going to meet with her? Mr. Speaker, the National Assembly adopted a unanimous motion for Raif Badawi. Canadian citizenship would be an important factor in his release and in his safety. The Prime Minister promised to help him in 2015, but since then he has done nothing. Out of sight, out of mind. His spouse is in Ottawa today. Even after 6 years of prison, she never gave up. Does this government and does the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of Foreign Affairs believe in freedom of expression? Does the government believe in the protection of families here? If so, they must meet her.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this is an important case to the Government of Canada. We are on it. We have raised this case repeatedly, and we will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. No. The Honourable Opposition House Leader has a point of order, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, I moved a motion that would concur in the report of the Trudeau report, and we did debate that as well as an amendment that we made to that report. We debated that this morning.
Order. I don't know if the honourable member's microphone is working properly because mine is turned on when it shouldn't be, so I'm going to make sure that that's.
You should start again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll start again. This morning, I moved a motion to concur in the Trudeau report, and so we debated that motion as well as an amendment that we made to it. We were actually hoping that we could vote on that, but the government did filibuster, which was rather interesting to watch them do that. There has been consultations, Mr. Speaker, and I hope that you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, that notwithstanding any standing orders or usual practices of the House, the report of the Ethics Commissioner entitled the Trudeau Report, tabled on Monday, January 29th, 2018, be not now concurred in, but that, pursuant to Section 2813 of the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons, it be referred back to the Commissioner with instructions that he amend the same to include recommendations to close the loopholes in the Code